Hello, everybody. I thought I'd put up a nice picture of grasses so you don't have to look at me all the time. But I'll start off on this slide for a little while, just get some of the background of grasses. It'll sound quite complicated, but it will get simpler. Grasses started to evolve from a common leafy ancestor found in the ground flora of tropical forests and understory, and that was about 70 million years ago. And they became widespread towards the end of the Cretaceous period. And the remains of grasses are found in coprolites, that's fossilized dinosaur droppings. Because over time, differing environmental factors meant that the plants diverged in various ways. And one of the first groups to break away was about 70 million years ago. Not so, 60 million years ago, and that was the bamboos, and also the group that includes rice and wild rice. Um, they broke away, leaving the Poidae, which includes wheat, barley, oats, and another 4,200 species uh, to carry on evolving within that same group. And then a further division came a bit later when the millets and the group including sorghum, maize, and sugarcane broke away. So the plants diversified and spread all over the globe. Worldwide, there's about 12,000 species of grasses, but there's only about 160 in the UK. And I'll be looking in detail at about 18. So that sort of simplifies things as an introduction. Um, they form part of every terrestrial vegetation type, really, and they dominate in bamboo forests, for example, and grassland habitats such as the prairies, the steppes, the pampas, and the veldt. And grasses are vital for us. Um, Currently, all crops grown for human and livestock consumption, 70% of them are grasses. Um, Going back to grasses themselves, grasses do flower. They've diverged from this leafy ancestor way back. They do flower, but they've evolved to be wind pollinated. So they lack sepals and petals. And if there's time later, I'll introduce you to a model I've got called Florrie the Floret and explain the structure of a grass flower. But it raises an interesting question, the answer to which I don't know. If so many plants co-evolved with insects for insect pollination, and it's such a good thing, insect pollination, why did the grasses lose that so long ago? Did they start evolving when there was a dearth of insects at that time? Who knows? Interesting. Um, as well as food, grass are important for us in many ways. Um, Apart from grain, there's sugarcane, bamboo shoots, lemongrass. They also provide shelter, straw thatch, reed thatch, bamboo matting, bamboo poles, etc. And they can also be grown as fuel. Miscanthus, for example, is grown as a, a biomass for a biofuel to make electricity. And maize can be converted to ethanol, which is a petrol substitute. Now, our grasses occur in most of the terrestrial habitats in the country, and important, a very important element of many of them, such as sand dunes, salt marsh, water marginal vegetation, reed beds, and other swamps. And they occur everywhere, from the foreshore, through farmland, playing fields, gardens, right up to the tops of our mountains. So you'll find grasses anywhere, 160 species of them. But to keep it simple, I'm going to base this talk on the Field Studies Guide to Common Grasses, and I'll have a closer look at just 18 of those species. But looking at the start of the slide, Here's a nice patch of vegetation, something fairly typical we could find locally, and of course it includes grasses. So we have cocksfoot, which I'm going to use lots of words now, which I'll explain later. That has a panicle when it's flowering, but it's a very clumpy panicle. It has very strongly pleated leaves, with a big keel along the back of the leaf. We've got false oak grass, and through that we've got barren brome with a very spreading panicle. The false oak grass is a panicle, but it hasn't opened out yet. Now, there's a little warning in of English names. This is goosegrass, which is a flowering plant, a scrambling plant. And this is our logo, Grassa parnassus, which isn't a grass at all. So I'll be just looking at grasses, except I don't know how to advance the slides. Why aren't the slides advancing, Steve? Ah, yeah. As I said, I'll be using the guide to common grasses and this symbol, these little googly eyes. These are the grasses that we'll be taking a closer look at. But these pamphlets that the Field Study Council produce are really good on a whole range of subjects. But for the grasses, it gives you the general look of the grass. You can tell whether the inflorescence is a spike or a panicle. It also gives you a look at the ligules, and it gives you the name and some idea of where they'll grow. For example, the ones with the green dots, the ones you'll frequently find in playing fields and even lawn grass mixes. The other ones we'll be looking at are tend to be more ruderal species. So there's another extra 5 grasses there, making up the 18 we'll be looking at in detail. Now, getting to see grasses can be tricky because when you're looking down on them in a field, they all merge in with each other. So a good tip for if you're looking for grasses is to take a walk along a grassy canal bank, because when you see them against the backdrop of the water, you can see a lot of the detail and see them very clearly. So here we've got examples of a spike and various examples of panicles. Panicles is where the grass stem branches out into numerous sub-branches, and the spikelets are attached at the end of these branches in various ways. So these very fine ones are a bent grass, and it's common bent. And they've got tiny spikelets on very fine branching. These spikes are crested dog's tail. So they're a very different format to the panicles. That's one of the major things you see at first when you're looking at grasses in flower, whether it's a spike or a spike-like inflorescence or a panicle. So this panicle is Yorkshire fog. It's got much bigger spikelets than the bent, as you can see. Very pale, quite often pinkish. And this is also Yorkshire fog, but in this, I think rather than being prior to opening out, this has been pollinated and is closing up again. There's a spent panicle here, very dried out. That's rough-stalk meadowgrass. You've also got ryegrass, which is another spike, and you've also got some sweet vernal grass here as well, and again a spike. And these are panicles. Though now they're all closed up, they look a bit like spikes, so that's something you need to look out for. This is red fescue. So grasses don't all flower at the same time of year. So that's why a winter talk is quite good, Because if you get the idea in mind that you're going to look at grasses, when they start appearing in April, going through to May, and most of them are flying by June, if you start early and get a few ones under your belt, you can then watch for them as they come through the seasons, and it breaks it down. It makes it simpler if you do them a few at a which are very hairy to attract the pollen. Because as I say, the whole family is wind pollinated. First of the grasses we're looking at is ryegrass. Ryegrass is a very common grass, so it's a good one to learn early on. You get it everywhere. You get it in, it can be a crop, get it in farmers' fields, you get it on playing fields, gardens, grass verges, and in a whole range of habitats in the wild. And it's one of those grasses when it's growing on in a big mass. You can actually spot it from a moving train or a speeding car, as long as you're the passenger, not the driver. Um, the lower surface of the leaf is smooth and shiny, but what happens after the leaf blade separates at the ligule, it tends to twist over and present the back of the leaf. And that's what the glossy back of the leaf catches the light. And a field of ryegrass actually does sparkle. The top side of the leaf is actually quite matte because it's quite strongly ridged. And that's a feature when you look at it closely. The ligule is very, very low, but ryegrass is one of those species that has an extra feature. These are called auricles, Auricle, as opposed to oracle. But the auricles, these are very delicate and they soon dry out. And if it's an old specimen, you might not see the auricles at all. But on quite a few species, the auricles are very helpful in identifying it. So that's something to look out for where you're looking at the ligule. And there's the ligule. It's a medium sort of height ligule, and it's sort of got a fairly rough edge. Some of them have extremely smooth edges. Some are very pointy and some are very ragged, as we'll see as we go along. So that's the perennial ryegrass. Important thing about the spikelets of ryegrass is you can see the group of separate flowers, the anthers just starting to come through here. The spikelets are quite flat and look a bit like miniature heads of ears of wheat, but they're attached to the stem or the rachis by their edge, not their flat face. And that's important to note because there's another very common grass, couch grass, which has very similar spikelets, but they're turned 90 degrees and they're attached by that face rather than the edge of the spikelet. So that's something to remember for later. Another common grass of pastures, meadows, and another grass which, like ryegrass, is very tolerant to trampling is crested dog's tail. So if there's a footpath going through an area of pasture, you quite often get it's often visible by a stripe of crested dog's tail or ryegrass going through the grassland because they can withstand the trampling pressure better than most of the other grasses. Now the spikes are quite textured, and you'll see why when you see it in close up. Here's the rachis. This is the grass in full flower, so the anthers are all hanging out, catching the wind, and the spikelets are all reflexed to allow the wind through both to the anthers and to the hairy styles. And it's quite a complicated looking thing. Once the flowering is finished and pollination taken place, spike closes up again. So the same grass, but it looks very different. Now, if you look, this is the same spike of crested dog's tail taken on the same day. If you turn it round 90 degrees, 180 degrees, in fact, you'll see that the rachis is clearly visible on the back. Well, it's not the back, but it's on the other side of the spike. So that's a useful uh, clue in identifying crested dog's tail as well. And once it's pollinated, it often, the hell spike curves and looks even more like a bit of a dog's tail. Now, the crested bit becomes the way the spikelets are formed, with this sort of crest of points at the ends of the glooms of the spikelet all the way along. So it's quite a complicated little structure. And they're actually on short branches as well. So sometimes this is thought of as being a tight panicle, though it's very spike-like in appearance. And then you see the ligule there. It's a very smooth grass, no hairs, and ligules there for comparing with the other species. Now, this is a very different grass. This is one of the so-called coarse grasses, one that's a sort of nutrient demanding. It grows very big. It can usually get up to waist height, depending how big you are, I suppose. But it's a panicle. It's a cocksfoot that we saw in the first um, slide. The spikelets are in big clusters or agglomerations, so hence the name Dactylis glomerata. And it's called Dactylis because the thick branches of the panicle reminded early botanists of fingers. So dactyls, so example, a pterodactyl is a wing-fingered flying reptile. But it's got the name cocksfoot because they quite often have this sort of vaguely sort of bird's footprint shape. But it's a very distinctive grass, and you'll find it everywhere. You can see even from this picture, the leaves, the blades are a sort of greyish green colour, which is useful. This is one in full flower, with all the anthers out catching the wind. And this is what the spikelets look more close, look like closer up. Very stout branches, and these spikelets all in great big agglomerations, a big one at the top and smaller ones as you go down the panicle. As I mentioned before, the leaf is very pleated, very folded, and the sheath has got a big pleat down the back as well. And the cross section tends to be more oval than round, which is the case in most of the grasses. The ligule is tall and very, very ragged. So that's, but it's such a distinctive grass, you hardly ever need to look at the ligule of a cocksfoot. And you can recognize it all year round as well, because the flowering heads are very persistent and they'll be there all winter. Now, another very common plant, usually lower, quite a bit lower in stature than the cocksfoot, is Yorkshire fog. I'm just doing these in the order they come in the on the Field Study Council. Fog is flowering. It has these pale spikelets, often with a pinky cast. It can look like a, a low mist across the ground. So these are in full flower, fully open. These are ones about to come. So, but they are the same grass. And like the cocksfoot, this tends to be quite greyish in colour in its sheath, but the greyness here is caused by a dense mat of small hairs that give it sort of a woolly look. And of course, Holcus lenatus means woolly, as in lanolin, the oil from sheep's wool. Here's a crib sheet that I prepared for a consultancy I used to work for on various grasses. This is just an example. This is the Yorkshire fog. When it's flowering, before it's fully flowered, it does look very different to when it's open. And at the base of the plant, you can see the roots here, the sheaves have this pink stripe up them, and that's very distinctive as well, to have this pale green with the pink stripe. Because it's soft and fuzzy, it reminds people of pajama legs. So it has the pink stripes there. And it's got a tallish ligule with a slightly serrated top. But you can see all the hairs, little tiny hairs all over the sheath, all over the nodes, and along the sides of the blade of the grass as well. And this is just to illustrate how different one grass can look. These are all picked on the same day. So you've got a couple that are yet come out, a panicle fully expanded, and then one that's sort of set seed and is dying back. And this, if you want to preserve your grasses, a way of doing it and keeping the colour, doing it like this. These are picked in one day, brought home, put on the platen of the printer and scanned. So that's quite useful for a lot of the smaller grasses. You'd have difficulty fitting a sort of a read onto your printer platen, but you can print bits of the panicles, get the record the spikelets, and it makes a sort of your own ready reckoner. Or you can press them and have the traditional herbarium. But of course, the herbarium specimens won't keep the colour the same way as the colour scan will. Here's another one out into the wilder meadows. This is meadow foxtail, Alipicurus. It's a meadow plant. It's a very early flowering grass. It has a dense spike, and it flowers April, early May. And it quite often gets missed from surveys because of its early flowering. If you're going out to look at a grassland and you go out in end of May, June, this will be finished, and they're not as persistent as the cocksfoot heads. And so unless you happen to look at all the ligules or spot the vegetation features, other grass flowers will take over, and you can end up missing out on this one. But it's one of my favorite grasses. This is this in full flower. Great long uh, stem to the anthers there. That's in full flower. These have finished flowering, and the anthers are fading and dying back and losing their original colour. This is what the spikelets are like. Very pretty. They're pale green with dark green stripes, and they have these long, silky awns coming from them. I've bent the spikelet back here just so you can see the shape of the spike back, so you can see the shape of the individual spikelets there. This, again, is pretty hairless grass, very neat, low ligule, a bit like a dog collar in reverse. And that's a very pleasant grass to identify. Sometimes it gets confused with Timothy. Now, Timothy has huge, great, long spikes, not like the much shorter spikes. of the foxtail. It also flowers much later, but otherwise it's same height. It tends to grow in more sort of marginal situations rather than an old meadow. You see it at the edges of fields, particularly. Again, it's flea and pratensis, so it is, associated with meadows. Here's a spike emerging from the sheath, and you can see straight away it lacks the long horns of the meadow foxtail. When you look at it more closely, the individual spikelets are pale green with dark green stripes, like the meadow foxtail, but there's only two stripes per spikelet, and these stripes end in a pair, in a bristle each. So you've got a pair of bristles. So they look a bit like little long-eared owls or something. And on the side, they've got projecting sideways hairs. So it's quite a different spikelet. So this is a case where a look at the spike and the spikelets will help you greatly in differentiating between these two spiked grasses. The ligule is very different as well. If you remember, the meadow foxtail has a very low, smooth-topped ligule. This has a tall and very ragged ligule, and is also tends to be much grayer green than um, the meadow as well. But I hope you agree that once you start looking closely at the grass flowers, they are actually quite beautiful. False oak grass. You'll find this quite frequently with cocksfoot. Between the two of them, they're both typical coarse grasses of ground with quite high fertility. So abandoned farmland, abandoned gardens, edges of fields, edges of woods, hedgerows, where there's a lot of nutrients available, you get these big, strong grasses. And they're interesting to have because many of our butterflies, the browns, for example, and some of the skippers, their larvae feed on the leaves of these coarse grasses, and they often overwinter either as eggs or larvae. Grows into the dense vegetation at the bottom of the base of the grasses. So they're valuable habitat. They're very common. They're obviously still worth having. Here's the panicle in full openness, very fine branches and spikelets, a single spikelet on the end of each branchlet, and each spikelet has a long horn protruding from it. Oh, in fact, you can see it better in this one. Individual florets, the long horn, which is why it's called oak grass, of course, because it's like a miniature version of the flower of the oaks, but it doesn't get the big edible grain, but it still has the long florets, the long horns. And then there's the ligule, and it's fairly hairless grass, quite a broad blade, and it's very lax. When the blades are, when the grass is in full green, these grow out and then flop, so you get a very distinctive curved shape to all the grass blades. Going to an annual grass now, soft brome. It's these big clumpy spikelets on a very dense panicle. This grows in sort of marginal areas. This one's on the edge of a low sea cliff, so hence you've got sea beet in with it as well. Um, Edges of fields, in fact, it's common field edge weed. This is what the spikelets look like. Quite dense clusters. and each individual floret has got its own awn, and the whole thing is very soft to the touch. This is just after the anthers have matured and have started to shrivel up. But so each spikelet looks like a head of barley almost, but there's lots of them all in the one panicle. You can see how hairy it is. The upper surface of the leaf is covered with long hairs. The underside of the blade has short hairs. The sheath is hairy, and the whole culm is hairy, and the whole thing is soft to the touch. It's got a medium-sized height ligule, and it's more or less serrated. And here, again, you can see how hairy the whole soft brome plant is. Now, there's another brome, the barren brome, which is closely related. It has a similar formatting of spikelet to the soft brome, but the whole thing is attenuated. The individual spikelets are long and narrow, and they have a long awn. This too has a ragged ligule, but it's not nearly as hairy as the soft brome. Once the seed is set and the plant's dying down, the culm is sort of sagged, bent over, and all the spikelets are hanging down, ready to drop their seeds. And this is what they look like. They're the same, as I say, same format as the soft brome, but longer and narrower, with these great big long horns extending from the tips of each spikelet. There's another one with long horns. This is the wall barley. Again, a weedy annual plant, like the two bromes, and like the field barley that are grown for malt and other animal feed and things, the crop barley, each spikelet has a long horn. And here this has got barren brome in with it, again showing long horns of almost equal length to the barley. And this is so distinctive. It's an annual, and it's you can find it almost at any stage, almost any time of the year. If it's suitable conditions for germination early in the year, the plants grow, and then the seeds ripen. If it's a dry period, they ripen, and you can see all the distributed seeds around the base here. Then if it gets wet again, it grows again. So you get all different stages of the same plant anytime during the growing season. And here it is towards the end of the growing season, but again, new plants coming up through it. You can see we're getting to July, August here with the blackberries starting to form. Now, common couch, we're going back now to a perennial species which forms really dense stands. It's a tall grass, like the falso grass and the cocksfoot, but it has spikes rather than panicles. And you get this in a lot of situations. It can dominate large areas of upper parts of the salt marsh, arable areas, gardens. It's one of considered a weed species by most gardeners. It's not a particularly hairy plant, but the upper surface of the leaf blade is downy. Like the ryegrass, it has auricles. And again, like the ryegrass, they quite often soon fade away. And it has very similar spikelets to the ryegrass, but if you remember, the ryegrass spikelets are joined to the rachis by the edge of each spikelet, whereas these are joined face to face. So they make a very different looking spike, and you can't actually see the rachis. You can always see the rachis quite clearly in ryegrass, but you only get little glimpses of it, such as there in the couch grass. And here, when they're opened out, shed the seeds, you can see the format up the stem of the couch grass there. Now we alter scale now to a much lower grass, another one that forms quite dense swards. This is sweet vernal grass, and this can flower even earlier than the meadow foxtail. It has a spike. You can see all these spikes, and each spikelet is very pointed, so you get these sort of quite jaggedy looking spikes. And a field of dominated by Anthoxantha moderatum is usually a sign that it's a less disturbed sward. It's an unimproved grassland. And this is just the sort of grassland that you should go out later on and look for orchids coming up in, because orchids and Anthoxanthum seem to like the same sort of conditions. So you quite often get the two together. And of course, it's not a tall grass, so it doesn't swamp out everything else like the coarse grasses like the couch and the cocksfoot and the false oak grass can do. This is what it looks like when the female, the hairy styles are fully extended, ready to catch any passing pollen. And once it's finished flowering, the spikes are very persistent, and they usually take on this lovely sort of golden yellow straw color. So you can still spot sweet vernal grass all through most of the summer, and sometimes into the winter. It's not been destroyed by trampling animals or eaten or anything, or cut down. And it's quite a hairy little grass, and there's a ring of long hairs around the ligule, and the ligule itself is quite tall and jaggedy edged, and all in all quite a distinctive grass. And when it's a field of this, a meadow of this is cut down, in a couple of days, as the grass starts to dry out, you get that fantastic new mown smell, a new mown hay smell, and that comes from coumarin. And sweet vernal grass is particularly rich in coumarin, so it contributes largely to the new mown hay aroma that you get. And there's grasses in their context. These are mainly Yorkshire fog. There's also a bit of red fescue in there. There's also some common bent. You can just see the tiny spikelets of common bent over here. So when you go out, this is what you're faced with. But if you just try and learn at least the 18 basic ones, you'll start fathoming them out more and more as you run across species which aren't the 18 basic ones. But common bent is one worth getting under your belt. This can form extensive swards, especially on in acid situations. And when it's flowering, you get this sort of fantastic stuff, purple haze across a bit of grassland. And you know almost instantly, well, that's going to be common bent. And common bent has a panicle, a wide spreading panicle, very finely branched, and the end of each branchlet has a single spikelet, very smooth and shiny and with a reddish coloration. So en masse, that's where you get that sort of haze across. Once the seeds have dropped, the panicle remains for quite a while. The spikelet is thinned out a lot, but you can see how delicate the whole structure is and how small these features are. And it's really quite distinctive amongst the grasses. And when you look at the leaf and the ligule, it's got a very low ligule. And that is very helpful because there's another bent which you'll come across, which is the creeping bent. And that is quite different in some respects, but has quite vaguely similar flowering uh, panicle. Now, creeping bent's Agrostis stolonifera. Now, a stolon is an overground creeping stem, and in Agrostis stolonifera, they're usually a reddish colour, a deep reddish colour. And the leaves are quite short, broad, where they meet the sheath, and then they taper to a narrow point. So the long, thin triangles, the leaves of creeping bent. And this is one on the Green Beach at Ainsdale, and it's a mega creeping bent. There's stolons everywhere. You won't often see it like that, but it shows you the general form of the plant. Now, common bent and creeping bent can look very similar when they're coming into flower because the panicle is closed and you don't see the characteristics of it very well at all. But when it opens, creeping bent never opens into such a wide, airy panicle. I mean, creeping bent doesn't open into such a wide, airy panicle as common bent does. It's quite a dense little thing. The spikelets themselves are about the same size. They're much more tightly gathered, much more clumpy. This is one is showing the anthers flowing. There's one of the red stolons in the background, so that it never gets that very light, airy feeling that common bent has. But if you're in any doubt, you just need to look at the ligule because the ligule of creeping bent is very tall and triangular and pointed. So totally unlike the low, smooth ligule of the common bent. Another common grass forming a dense, low sward is red fescue, and this is it can dominate large areas of salt marsh. In fact, sea-washed turf, which was much sought after by gardeners for making the best lawn grass, is from fescue swards harvested from the seashore. Morecambe Bay used to have quite an industry harvesting sea-washed turf. It's very fine grass, very, very narrow leaves, and it has a panicle of very narrow, pointy spikelets. So they're long and thin and clustered, not like the individual florets of the bents. And they have little bristles coming off the ends as well. This is what it looks like. It's flowering. When it's in full flower, that's when the panicle's at its most extended. And see here you can see the individual florets have their anthers hanging out, catching all the breezes, sending that pollen away to be captured by the next one along. It's a very smooth grass, no hairs, next to no ligule, and very narrow leaves. A sward of ryegrass is very fine, and it's often one of the main features on the greens and around the holes of golf courses because that is very fine grass and it takes mowing very well and just produces a very, very, very fine sward. Um, and when you get an undisturbed bit of festuca, red festuca grassland, these narrow leaves don't seem to rot down. They sort of form what's called a thatch. So you get this great wad of dead leaves with the bright green new leaves springing through it. Now we'll come to the meadow grasses. There's a whole family of these. This is one of the larger ones of the common ones that's featured on the Field Study Council leaflet. This is the rough stalk meadowgrass. This has a big panicle with lots and lots of spikelets on it. They're a lot smaller than the fescue spikelets, but a lot bigger than the bent spikelets. You see there, nice spreading panicle. They're more clustered than the bent, common bent ever gets, but they're not nearly as long and narrow individual spikelets as the red fescue has. This is one just emerging, and to the left, you can see its ligule. It has a huge long ligule with a ragged top, and that is very helpful for sorting out. The ligules are very helpful for sorting out the different species of meadowgrass, because the other one that you're most likely to confuse it with is the smooth stalk meadowgrass, has a much shorter, low ligule. This is the ligule in close up. You can see it's pretty distinctive. Once you bend the blade back and take the culm out, you'll see that large membranous ligule. This is another, back to annual species again. This is the annual meadowgrass. And this little plant can grow anywhere and everywhere and at all times of year. It's a real opportunist, and you get this in cracks in busy urban pavements, the edges of footpaths, the edges of fields, any disused derelict land. You get annual meadowgrass. And you can see it's the same general format as the rough stalk meadowgrass, but much bigger spikelets in relation to the whole plant. This is it flowering. A simple panicle. Quite a long ligule and a very ridged blade, which ends in a point, which I'll show you a better picture of that later. Smooth stalk meadowgrass, generally much smaller than the rough stalk meadowgrass, tends to be grayer, and the spikelets are more clumpy, and the leaves suddenly go into an abrupt point, and it's a three-dimensional point, which I'll hopefully show you later. Here's a smooth stalk meadowgrass flowering, smaller panicle than the rough stalk meadowgrass, slightly larger spikelets in proportion. And there's the ligule, a quite low ligule compared to the great big tall one of the rough stalk meadowgrass. And this is the typical poa shape of a leaf blade. The sides are parallel, and then they suddenly, sides come together, but the keeled bottom then comes up to meet it. So you get this three-dimensional sort of boat-shaped tip, which is typical of the poas. Most other grasses just are flat and end in a point, but this actually makes it this three-dimensional structure. And that's a way of instantly telling the poas from most other grass families. And there's the low ligule. It's sort of serrated on top, but it's nothing like the tall ligule of the rough stalk meadowgrass. So remember your ligules. Back to here again. By now you will know, I hope, that that's common bent. And this is crested dogstail, red fescue, rough stalk meadowgrass, gone well over, ryegrass, and the ryegrass seen from the side disappears when you look at it sideways on, and then the sweet vernal grass. So hopefully some of these things will start sticking in your mind, and you'll enjoy identifying them and looking at the flowers closely with a lens. Now, obviously, that's just a quick run through of some of the species on this field guide. There's lots of resources for working out the grasses. I'm sure Steve will be able to tell you some more later. This is the Hubbard is the sort of go-to grass book and has been for years. This is the copy I got in 1969. and this is a more current revised version. That is excellent book for gives you all the detail. There's fantastic line illustrations all the way through. If you'd rather have painted illustrations, the Francis Rose book on grasses, sedges, and rushes, etc. As I said, the field guide, the Collins books, and the BSBI handbook on the grasses, Cope and Gray. That is excellent as well. But if you want something, if you prefer looking at photographs, there's one produced by the National Biodiversity Data Centre of the Republic of Ireland on Ireland's grasses. And of course, all the grasses in Ireland are also in the UK as well. Uh, Except they haven't got quite as many as us because they were cut off from the mainland Europe earlier. But looking at grass keys, there's keys in that, there's keys in this. And of course, Stace, the general flora, has got very good keys to the grasses as well. So we just looked at a few, but there are whole habitats which you haven't really touched on. So, for example, there's a whole series of woodland grasses. This is one of the bigger ones. This is hairy brome. You can see it looks rather like the barren brome with these big drooping panicles. Very similar format, but it's got these very papery edges to the spikelets there. The main thing about it is its hairs. It's got outrageously hairy legs. And then later on, it looks like that. And then another woodland grass is the wood millet, a very lax grass. It sort of flops over the place. It's a very large grass on the whole. It's got big panicle. You see it's just sprouting here. But the first sight, the seeds look very similar to the bent seeds, the bent spikelets, but it's on a much larger scale. And you only find it in woodland. It's got a nice long ragged ligule. The Scampsia flexuosa, the tufted hair grass, is a woodland grass as well, but it also grows in marshy grassland, and that has a very dense clump and big panicles of silky spikelets and very long split ligule, and the upper surface of the blade is strongly ridged, and each ridge carries a whole series of very sharp bristles. So you know about that one when you get hold of a plant of that. And there's one in full flower, and big, strong tussock, and a sort of fountain of silvery panicles ahead out of the top. And then, of course, we're very well off for sand dunes near us. So there's a whole series of sand dune grasses. In the foreground, you can see lime grass, and that's got a very dense, waxy coating to protect it from sandblast and from salt penetration. And behind it is marram, which is the grass of the dunes. So there's whole loads and loads to look at. But you don't need to look at them all at once. By starting in winter, you can then go out into local areas and start seeing grasses as they appear, one or two or three at a time, and start learn them. And as new ones arrive, you can accrue and gradually carry on and carry on. But so from now, you can look forward to spring and the appearance of the grasses, and as well as the ligules and the panicles and the spikes and the spikelets and all that. The colours are important. Look out for the different shades of green, because you eventually get those in your mind, and you can spot grasses by colour in lots of cases. So that's all for now.